This morning, federal agents arrested 89 truck drivers in the largest corporate cartel infiltration in American history.
11:47 p.m., January 14, 2026. A joint federal task force confirmed the largest coordinated trucking raid in United States history. 89 commercial vehicles seized simultaneously across 11 states. 4.2 tons of fentanyl, 2.1 million fentanyl pills, 18 tons of methamphetamine, 42 tons of cocaine, and $3.1 billion in cartel assets frozen in a single night. But here's what they didn't tell you at the press conference. This wasn't just a drug bust. This was the dismantling of a shadow empire that had corrupted an entire state government from the inside. A network so deeply embedded in American infrastructure that it took federal investigators 3 years just to understand what they were looking at. And the man at the center of it all? He wasn't a cartel boss hiding in the mountains of Sinaloa. He was an American, a public servant, a man who shook hands with senators and cut ribbons at school openings. What I'm about to tell you will change how you see the border, how you see politics, how you see the trucks rolling past you on every American highway. Stay with me, because what comes next is worse. 4:32 a.m., Phoenix, Arizona. The city was still sleeping. A thin layer of desert fog clung to the asphalt, turning the streetlights into pale orange halos. The only sound was the distant hum of the I-10, the concrete artery that pumps commerce from the Mexican border all the way to the Atlantic coast. In a strip mall parking lot on the south side, 12 black Suburbans sat with their engines idling. Inside, FBI tactical teams checked their equipment one final time. Across the street, DEA agents confirmed their target coordinates through encrypted headsets. 2 blocks away, an IC rapid response unit waited in an unmarked van, their breath visible in the cold air. At exactly 4:33 a.m., the order came through. Execute. The first target was a warehouse on South 24th Street, officially registered as a cold storage facility for agricultural products. For 2 years, neighbors had complained about the strange hours, the unmarked trucks arriving after midnight, the security guards who carried themselves like soldiers. The FBI didn't knock. The breaching charge turned the reinforced steel door into shrapnel. Flashbang grenades lit up the interior like artificial lightning. Agents in black tactical gear moved through the smoke with practiced precision, their rifle-mounted flashlights cutting through the chaos. What they found inside wasn't produce. The cold storage units had been converted into a fentanyl processing operation. Tables lined with pill presses. Industrial mixers coated with white powder. Workers in hazmat suits frozen mid-task, their hands still holding the deadly product. The seizure count from that single location, 890,000 fentanyl pills. Enough to kill every resident of Phoenix twice over. But that was only the beginning. Simultaneously, DEA teams hit a luxury car dealership in Scottsdale. On paper, it sold high-end imports to wealthy clients. In reality, the service bays were modification shops where cartel engineers installed hydraulic compartments into vehicles destined for drug transport. Agents found 17 cars with hidden voids already loaded with cocaine, ready for distribution. In Tucson, ICE agents stormed a residential compound that had been identified as a human trafficking transit point. Inside, they found 43 migrants locked in converted bedrooms, some of whom had been held for weeks while the cartel negotiated ransom payments with their families. The conditions were medieval. No ventilation, buckets for toilets, armed guards who fled through a back tunnel the moment the raid began. That tunnel led agents to something they hadn't expected. It connected to a second property 200 yards away, a legitimate-looking construction company. And inside that company's office, behind a false wall, investigators found a server room, 12 blade servers, military-grade encryption. And when the FBI's cyber forensics team finally cracked the system, they discovered something that made the drug seizures look like a footnote. They had found the nerve center of the entire operation. 9:15 a.m., FBI Regional Cyber Forensics Laboratory, Phoenix Field Office. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the cramped workspace where 3 federal analysts hunched over their terminals. The servers recovered from the construction company sat in evidence bags on a nearby table, their blinking lights now dark, but their contents were alive on screen. The encryption had taken 14 hours to break. What emerged was a network diagram so complex it looked like a constellation map. Shell companies, ghost corporations, offshore accounts in the Caymans, Panama, and Liechtenstein, charitable foundations that existed only on paper, restaurant chains that never served a customer, logistics firms that owned no trucks. The analysts called their supervisor. She called Washington. By noon, the conference room was filled with agents from 4 different agencies. On the screen, a single name pulsed at the center of the network like a malignant heart. Project Dust Devil. That was the cartel's internal code name for their Arizona operation. And as investigators traced the financial threads, they began to understand the true scope of what they had uncovered. Project Dust Devil wasn't just a smuggling network. It was a complete takeover of Arizona's border infrastructure, orchestrated over a decade with patience, precision, and billions of dollars in cartel investment. The shell companies owned trucking licenses. They held contracts with state agencies. They had purchased way stations, rest stops, and maintenance facilities along key smuggling corridors. But the most disturbing discovery was the authorization structure. Every major decision in the network required digital approval from a single encrypted key. The analysts traced the key through 17 layers of corporate obfuscation. When they finally identified the owner, the room went silent. The key belonged to Governor Marcus Whitfield. Whitfield had served as Arizona's governor for 6 years. He was a moderate, a deal maker, a politician known for his tough-on-crime rhetoric and his aggressive border security speeches. He had stood at press conferences denouncing the cartels while cameras flashed. And according to these files, he had been their primary American asset for over a decade. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank transfers to offshore accounts timed to the day after major border policy decisions. Encrypted communications discussing tunnel locations, shipment schedules, and law enforcement raid timings. Personnel recommendations for state positions that placed cartel-friendly officials in critical roles. Governor Whitfield hadn't just been corrupted by the Sinaloa Cartel. He had been their architect, their political shield, their key to transforming Arizona into the most efficient drug corridor in the Western Hemisphere. This was not corruption. This was command-level collusion. And the operation wasn't finished. According to the files, Project Dust Devil was entering its final phase. A phase the cartel called permanence. The next part of this story is what kept federal investigators awake for weeks. Stay with me. 5 a.m., January 16, 2026. FBI Joint Operations Command Center, Quantico, Virginia. The Situation Room was designed for moments exactly like this. 40-foot screens displaying real-time satellite imagery. Secure communication links to every major field office in the country. Direct lines to the Department of Justice and the White House Situation Room. On the central display, a map of the American Southwest glowed with 89 red markers. Each marker represented a commercial truck currently in motion. Each truck was operated by a driver identified as part of the Sinaloa Cartel's distribution network. And each truck was loaded with narcotics worth millions of dollars. The targeting data had taken 3 years to compile. The FBI had tracked shipping patterns, analyzed fuel purchase records, and installed covert GPS trackers on suspect vehicles. They had built profiles on every driver, every dispatcher, and every warehouse worker connected to the network. Now it was time to shut it all down at once. The operation was code-named Desert Storm 2. Over 1,200 federal agents were positioned across 11 states. FBI SWAT teams, DEA tactical units, ICE enforcement squads, U.S. Marshals, Arizona National Guard units providing perimeter security, and in the skies above the border, for Black Hawk helicopters and 2 Predator drones maintaining aerial surveillance. At 5:30 a.m., the command came. All units execute. In the Arizona desert west of Yuma, a convoy of 6 semi-trucks was moving north on Highway 95. To any observer, they looked like ordinary freight haulers making an early morning run. The drivers had valid commercial licenses. The manifests showed agricultural equipment bound for distribution centers in Nevada. The drivers never saw the roadblock until it was too late. 3 FBI tactical vehicles emerged from behind a desert ridge, their emergency lights painting the sand red and blue. Ahead, state police cruisers formed a barrier across both lanes. A Black Hawk helicopter descended to 500 feet, its spotlight turning night into noon. The lead driver tried to radio a warning. His transmission was jammed. Agents moved with overwhelming force, pulling drivers from their cabs at gunpoint. When K-9 units alerted on the trailers, the seizure teams moved in with cutting tools. Behind the false walls of those 6 trucks, agents found 2,400 kilograms of methamphetamine. Street value, $180 million. In Albuquerque, a transnational trucking hub was surrounded by DEA agents at 5:31 a.m. The facility processed over 300 shipments per day, making it one of the busiest freight terminals in the region. What the legitimate workers didn't know was that a third of those shipments contained hidden compartments. The raid lasted 42 minutes. 17 cartel operatives were arrested. The seizure included 8 tons of cocaine, 600 kilograms of fentanyl, and a server farm containing encrypted communications with Sinaloa leadership in Mexico. In Las Vegas, FBI teams hit a luxury resort that had been identified as a money laundering front. The casino had been purchased 3 years earlier by a shell company linked to Project Dust Devil. While tourists played slots on the main floor, The executive suites above had been converted into a cash processing center. Agents found $23 million in currency, sorted by denomination and ready for transport to offshore accounts. In Los Angeles, ICE agents raided a shipping container facility in the Port District. Intelligence indicated that cartel operatives had corrupted several longshoremen and customs inspectors, allowing containers marked as legitimate imports to bypass screening. When agents opened the flagged containers, they found false floors concealing 340 kilograms of heroin and documentation linking the shipments to distributors in 6 American cities. By 11 a.m., the operation statistics were staggering. All 89 targeted trucks had been seized. 412 individuals were in federal custody. The narcotic seizure totaled 42 tons of cocaine, 18 tons of methamphetamine, 4.2 tons of fentanyl, and 2.1 million fentanyl pills. Cash seizures exceeded $67 million, with an additional $3.1 billion in assets frozen pending forfeiture proceedings. The cartel's logistics network had taken 15 years to build. It was dismantled in 6 hours. But the most important arrest was still to come. Governor Marcus Whitfield was having breakfast at his Phoenix residence when the FBI arrived. His security detail, all of whom had been vetted by the Bureau in advance, stepped aside as agents presented the warrant. The charges were read in his kitchen, surrounded by family photos and campaign memorabilia. Conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, money laundering, racketeering, bribery, human trafficking, and under the continuing criminal enterprise statute, charges that carried the possibility of life imprisonment. Whitfield said nothing. His attorney, contacted within minutes, advised him to remain silent, but the evidence spoke for him. Over the following weeks, federal prosecutors unsealed documents showing the full extent of the governor's involvement. He had appointed the state's director of transportation, a man named Gerald Hess, who had systematically weakened inspection protocols along key smuggling routes. He had installed a compliant police commissioner, Janet Reeves, who had redirected patrol resources away from cartel corridors. He had placed allies in the state legislature who blocked funding for border technology upgrades. Every decision looked like politics. In reality, it was coordination. The investigation revealed that 147 state employees had been compromised at various levels of the conspiracy. Border Patrol supervisors who filed false reports, highway maintenance workers who disabled cameras, court clerks who expedited bail for arrested cartel members. For honest officers who had spent years fighting the cartels, the revelations were devastating. One veteran state trooper, interviewed anonymously, described the moment he realized his own commander had been on the cartel payroll. He said it felt like discovering your father was a stranger. Everything he thought he knew about the chain of command was a lie. The corruption wasn't a few bad apples. It was a parallel system operating within the legitimate government, answering not to the citizens of Arizona but to the Sinaloa Cartel. Federal agents began the process of arrest and removal. Over the following month, 89 state employees were charged with various crimes related to the conspiracy. Some were low-level functionaries who had taken small bribes. Others were senior officials who had knowingly facilitated the movement of drugs that killed thousands of Americans. The state's law enforcement infrastructure would take years to rebuild. The scope of Project Dust Devil extended far beyond Arizona's borders. As investigators analyzed the seized servers, they discovered that the network had established distribution routes reaching 32 states, trucking contractors in Texas, warehouse facilities in Nevada, financial processing centers in Colorado, distribution hubs as far east as Tennessee. The operational model was elegant in its simplicity. Drugs crossed the Mexican border through a network of tunnels, most located near Nogales. From there, they were transported to processing facilities in the Phoenix metropolitan area, where they were repackaged and loaded into commercial trucks. These trucks merged into the legitimate freight traffic of America's highway system. They traveled alongside families on vacation, alongside delivery vehicles carrying packages, alongside tankers hauling fuel. The cartel's analysts had mapped every enforcement checkpoint, every way station, every stretch of highway where inspections were common. The compromised officials ensured that cartel trucks were never stopped. Manifests were falsified. Weight records were adjusted. Patrol schedules were shared in advance. The network could move 15 tons of narcotics per week without triggering a single alert. But the most chilling discovery was the final phase of Project Dust Devil. The documents called it permanence. The cartel had been positioning assets to survive any single disruption. They had established redundant routes through New Mexico and California. They had cultivated relationships with officials in neighboring states. They had created emergency protocols that would activate replacement networks within 48 hours of any law enforcement action. Their goal was not just to profit from Arizona. Their goal was to make Arizona permanently dependent on cartel infrastructure, to embed themselves so deeply into the state's economy and government that removing them would cause more damage than tolerating them. They wanted to become essential, and they were closer than anyone realized. The final document in the Project Dust Devil files was a strategic projection. It estimated that within 5 years, the cartel's legitimate business holdings in Arizona would exceed $8 billion. Their political influence would extend to both state legislative chambers. Their infrastructure would be indistinguishable from the state itself. They weren't infiltrating Arizona. They were colonizing it. The human cost of this operation cannot be measured in seizure statistics. In 2025, fentanyl killed over 75,000 Americans. Many of those deaths can be traced directly to the supply chains that Project Dust Devil operated. Every pill pressed in those Phoenix warehouses ended up in a community, in a school, in a home. The methamphetamine destroyed families across rural America. The cocaine-fed addiction in cities from coast to coast. The human trafficking operations treated migrants as commodities to be exploited and discarded. Behind every number is a name. A mother who lost her son. A child who lost their father. A community that lost its future. Governor Whitfield stood at press conferences and spoke about protecting Arizona's families. He looked into cameras and promised to fight the cartels. And every word was a lie, delivered while the bodies piled up. Power does not always need violence. Sometimes it only needs silence and ambition. The silence of officials who looked away. The ambition of politicians who chose profit over duty. The slow erosion of trust that makes citizens question whether their government serves them or serves itself. That is what this story reveals. Not just a drug bust. Not just arrests and seizures. But a warning about what happens when organized crime meets political opportunity. When cartels stop thinking like criminals and start thinking like corporations. When they realize that buying a politician is cheaper than fighting a war. The federal indictments were unsealed on January 22, 2026. Governor Marcus Whitfield faces 47 counts including conspiracy to distribute narcotics and continuing criminal enterprise charges. If convicted on all counts, he faces a mandatory life sentence without possibility of parole. Gerald Hess, the former transportation director, has agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. His testimony is expected to be central to the government's case. Janet Reeves, the former police commissioner, was arrested attempting to board a flight to Mexico City. She is currently being held without bail. Of the 89 drivers arrested in the operation, 73 have accepted plea agreements. The remaining 16 are awaiting trial. The legitimate employees of the compromised trucking companies, the mechanics and dispatchers and administrative staff who had no knowledge of the criminal operations, have largely been cleared of wrongdoing. But many have lost their jobs as the companies face bankruptcy and asset forfeiture. They are the collateral damage. The innocent people who trusted that their employers were legitimate, that their government was honest, that the trucks rolling past them on the highway were carrying nothing but ordinary freight. The investigation continues. Federal prosecutors have indicated that additional indictments are expected. The network extended further than initially believed, and some of its branches remain active. But the core has been destroyed.